So the students are heading into the back for the photograph. Thank you again, Mr. Peter Wold. Thank you, Governor Gordon, for an excellent keynote address. I think very appropriate for the place and time we're at. Our next panel is going to focus on one of Wyoming's key industries and a focus of my research program over the years, and that's oil and gas. We have an exceptional panel for you today, and it's led by Mr. Lon Whitman, Director of the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. Mr. Whitman and esteemed panelists, would you please take your place on the stage? And as with other panels, please submit questions on the pieces of paper, hold them on up. The students will grab them and deliver them to Holly, who get them to the stage. Thank you, Lon and esteemed panelists. Here they come. Thanks, Lon.
All right, thank you and good afternoon. And want to thank everyone again for joining us for this conference. My name's Lon Whitman, and the governor did a very excellent job of opening up this panel for the afternoon. The governor in the state of Wyoming is unique, and it has what's known as an Enhanced Oil Recovery Commission, an agency that was set up by some of the people that Governor Gordon mentioned, Tom Stroop from Casper, Wyoming, Peter Wold. In 2004, legislatively, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Commission was formed. And I'm the director of their operating unit, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. We're located in Casper, and we're funded by the state to work with operators in the state to get more oil out. They like that revenue, the revenue that Governor Gordon mentioned. I think it's important to realize that oil and gas in the state of Wyoming, the last numbers provided $275 million in severance taxes to the budget. And they also paid over $1.23 billion in taxes for oil and gas. And that's what fuels a lot of the economy in Wyoming, as Governor Gordon mentioned, that mineral extraction remains critical. So we have an excellent panel this afternoon. We're very fortunate to have some pretty nice panelists with great histories that I think provide a lot of information for you. We will have the question and answer. You feel free to use the cards that are on your table, and we'll try to address those. So I'll ask each of you, please, to take as much time as you'd like. We can start with Mr. Berry. Nice introduction about yourself in Wyoming and Continental Resources.
Thanks. I'm Bill Berry, the CEO of Continental Resources. I've been in the energy industry for almost 50 years. So petroleum engineer from Mississippi State. I had a chance to work literally just about everywhere in the world with the company. And one of the things that really was clear to me early on in my career is the importance of energy. I've lived in really good, strong economies, really poor economies, and there's nothing more important to the quality of life of mankind than energy. So I was delighted I had kind of stumbled into petroleum engineering as a field, had a wonderful career with Phillips, ConocoPhillips, and then had another opportunity with Continental Resources, joined their board about 8 years ago, and then became CEO about 2.5 years ago. Spectacular company doing spectacular things. We're delighted to be back here in Wyoming. Can't tell you how much fun this is to come back to Wyoming, have a chance to work here. We actually drilled our third horizontal well ever was in Wyoming. We're now up to 2,000 or 3,000 horizontal wells. But and back in the 90s, we tried to make a start here. The geology and us didn't quite get along as well as we would have liked to have had. This time around, it actually has come full circle for us. So we're the second largest leaseholder in the Powder River Basin, second largest producer and we're probably the number one, number two driller in the basin. So just delighted to have a chance to be with everybody today. Thank you.
That's Steve.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Lon. Thanks, Holly. Thanks, John. And thanks to the Wold Foundation. I had the luxury of being around in Wyoming for a long time, although I'm from West Texas. And I got to meet John before he passed. Special man. Peter and Marla and Jack, family, a wonderful family. It's just an honor to be here today. As I said, I'm from West Texas, and West Texas and Wyoming have a lot in common. I wish we had coal like you do. We don't have any nuclear either, but we have a lot of EOR. And when Jim Steitman approached me to be on the technical advisory board 15 years ago, I think now, so for longstanding Wyoming, that I really felt like this was the place to be. And maybe I could help a little bit with all the history we've had with EOR in West Texas, with advancing EOR in Wyoming. And clearly Lon and his predecessors have done exactly that. It's a big deal here. And now we do a CO2 conference in Midland every year. We're on our 28th, if you can imagine. And we saw 20 years ago the convergence of CCS, carbon capture and storage, with EOR, because we store a lot of CO2 when we do EOR, CO2 EOR. And so we propagated that message. I'm a real believer in technology transfer and education. And so we did that through our conference. And it really became, and Wyoming's been integrated in that conference forever. So we thank you for that as well. But I think I couldn't amplify the governor's statements any more than I can. Exactly, this is going to be where a lot of the innovations and technology improvements occur, one of which will be CCS and CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which we call EOR. There's other ways to utilize CO2, but that's the big one. That's the huge one. So I guess that's probably all I want to say for now, except that some of the problems the technology transfer involves conversions of units. In the oil and gas industry, we talk in surface volumes. And in the CCS world, they talk in mass and weight volumes. And so if we have a chance later on, I'd like to show a slide or two to kind of help everybody with that conversion, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the risks we see coming, most of which don't exist in Wyoming geologies, I would say. But they are risky in some places that are being considered for storage today. And I think Wyoming can help in that process as well. So I'll turn it over here.
Thank you, Steve. Dr. Rasu.
Thank you very much, Lon, and good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks to Holly and her team for arranging this great conference. I'm relatively new to Wyoming. Only this semester I started my new role as the department head of petroleum engineering program at University of Wyoming. I came from University of North Dakota with a crew of about 10 people. And I am honored to have the endowed position chair, which is supported by Mr. Dave Lenormand, who is sitting here. So I really want Dave to thank you for the support that you provided to make this big deal happen. I worked at University of North Dakota in the same position for about 7 years. And I had also the honor to have the Continental Resources Distinguished Professor position, which came from Bill Berry and Mr. Harold Ham. Thank you very much, Bill, and your team. Prior to that, I was in Australia in Curtin University for about 9 years, and I was doing the same job. And before that, I was doing almost the same job in the Middle East. So I was basically hired to develop petroleum engineering program, and now they move more towards the energy, to educate, hopefully, the hands-on practical engineers we need for the future of the state and the country. My hope is that with the expansion of the petroleum engineering program that's currently we are planning to do, I'm continuing the work that the previous people did in the department. And I'm hoping that I can expand the department in terms of education, doing practical research for the industry, and make Wyoming the place that it really deserves to be in terms of energy, in terms of the resources, as the governor clearly mentioned that. So this state has significant opportunities and significantly can grow to the highest level. So we want to be hopefully on the higher side in terms of the energy and also oil and gas. So I'm hoping with the support of the industry people, we can achieve that. So with my background also in the industry, I worked for Schlumberger for about 18 years now as a consultant and also instructor for the training program. So I'm hoping to be able to blend the industry and bridge the gap between the industry and university in a way that we can really bring the industry type of mentality into the university and educate the students with the needs of the industry and support them for the future growth of the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rusli. Let's start our focus and look a little bit at what Governor Gordon brought up about us, about the state and the role of the oil and gas industry. It's a big one. It's one of the most important parts of the mineral extraction world in Wyoming. Mr. Berry, could you maybe highlight some of the directions Continental's going in Wyoming? You mentioned your second largest land area in Powder River Basin. And sounds like you must have some nice plans moving forward. It'd be great to hear what your plans are.
Well, thanks, Lon. Yeah, again, we're just so delighted to be back in Wyoming, and this is a really, really important part, one of the four pillars of our company at Wyoming. And we've got, it all starts with the rocks, and those of you in the petroleum industry understand that, starts and ends with the rocks, and the rocks in Wyoming are really good. So we really like the rocks here. It's going to be a great foundation. We've got probably 20% of our geoscientists in the company that are working on Wyoming alone. Kind of demonstrates the focus that we have. 2 rigs going to 3 rigs. So a lot of drilling activity. We probably had about 20% of the wells completed over the last year that were Continentals, and we're looking at continuing to grow that. If you look at the acreage that we have here, there's no reason that we shouldn't be running 5 or 6 rigs, for that acreage position, with a couple of caveats. One, there's a learning curve, and we as a company are going through a learning curve. We as an industry are going through that learning curve. And the other element is there's a huge attribute that disadvantages Wyoming versus the other places. And this is one that all of us collectively can do a better job on. That's cost. If you look at the cost for us to do the exact same activity here, it's probably 25% higher than it is in the other basins. So there's a little bit of a crack in the code geologically that makes sure we can get the volume out. And then the other side is how do we crack that code on cost? All of us play a role on that. One of the biggest drivers, I think everyone knows in any kind of business, biggest drivers of cost is cycle time. So whatever we can do every single day, cycle time matters. And the other is cooperation, and so it's cooperation across the whole spectrum. I had a chance to spend some time with Governor Gordon a few weeks ago and talk to him about the wonderful attributes of Wyoming. The rocks starts and ends there, the people, and the government policy. And I think Wyoming's done a great job of getting ahead. He talked about going with the class 6 wells and ability to do that. That sets the stage for the type of government you're dealing with. It's progressive, it's responsive, it wants to get the right things done to be able to supply energy. So that whole combination has to come together, and we need to collaborate, cooperate with all the different functions here. Dr. Rusli and I were talking earlier about, even with the university, and talking with some of the students there, what can we do to improve our operations here to make it more economic, so that this is the most economically advantaged part of the world that we can operate.
Thank you. I wondered if you could expand a little bit on that 25% cost addition. I think that's something that is important to look at and see how we can support that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And part of it, unfortunately, is self-inflicted. And that the industry, we've all seen the cycles that we've all been through, and the companies, the operators go through cycles, the service companies go through these kind of cycles. And so what's happened is that we've ended up undermining the service industry, which is a big part of the cost structure here. One thing we did as part of our DNA, it's one of the things that I always admired about this company. And like I said, I spent most of my career with other companies, but this company, always really cares about its people, cares about its constituents, cares about the stakeholders, the places that we operate. And during the downturn, so you guys remember 2020, what happened there? Those in the petroleum world will remember our oil price was actually minus $37 a barrel. So we were having to pay people to come take our oil and move it somewhere. Even if we wanted to keep it, no, they had to pay us to, we were having to pay them to come haul it off. So what happened during that time is everything slowed down. A lot went to zero activity. We chose not to in the areas we were operating that time. And that time it was up in North Dakota, in the Bakken, in Oklahoma, and the Anadarko. We deliberately kept rigs running, kept service companies running, because we knew that was such an important part, not ours. They weren't subsidiaries of our company. They were third party, but it was so important to do. And so the industry has kind of caused this myself, the oil prices, and you can blame anybody on that, however you want to blame that. But as an industry, we've not done as good a job of ensuring the viability of the service industry. That's something we need to do. And there is cooperation between companies. We're doing some today where we're looking for stages in between when we're working on something and we've got to pause. Okay, which other operator can pick up that service entity, be it a STEM crew or whatever, so that we can keep those guys in a steady state, so that we attract people back to Wyoming rather than them all exiting and going to other states.
Thank you. I'll follow up with one last question for you. Is there a role for the government, for the state government or levels of government to help address that problem?
Yes. There's a huge role, and we were joking earlier, Dr. Rasuli and the students we had there about. He asked, "Well, what can we do to help?" And I said, "Well, the number one thing you could do, you really can't do, and that's help the governments. Because if you look at worldwide, including the U.S., worldwide, the energy crisis that we have today is again self-inflicted. You go country by country, you see what's happening. Everything from those that are supplying the product, look at what's happening in those countries. Those that are using the product, look at what's happening in Europe. To those that can do both, look at what's happening here. And it's just a whole host of flawed policies that are out there. And so what's happening with the government, and Governor Gordon did a good job of describing this, is the government's job really should be identify problems. Hey, we want to solve this problem, then turn it over to the free market for the solutions. And what's happening is the government is trying to pick the solutions, and we've seen that fail so many times. In the 70s, with those of you guys that were working in the 70s, in the Fuel Use Act that came out of the U.S. government, President Carter, Senator Biden, this is one that said we're running out of natural gas in the United States. It is therefore prohibited to be able to use natural gas for generating power in the United States. Wrong answer. Should have been, and before that, the NGPA and things like that. You remember the Natural Gas Policy Act, where prices of gas were up and down like this, again, self-inflicted. We were having gas prices at 20 cents and you couldn't make any sense out of this. Free market floated, more gas supplied, innovation came in with what happened with shale, things that Harold Hamm did, if you're able to develop the oil side, and things that George Mitchell did with the gas side of things. So if the things that the government, and this is at the state level, and so Governor, I've talked a little bit about what can we work on together, because particularly in Wyoming, you are so sometimes subordinated to the federal entities that are here and the leases that are going on. The IRA that just came out, that is saying, okay, we're going to have a requirement for 2 million acres a year. Well, at the same time, the industry is under lawsuit for 4 million acres. So this is going on at the same time. It's all government induced. And so if we can go in and your governor, you've got an outstanding governor that understands this, understands how to maneuver it. And all of us need to be trying to champion with everybody we can, from government in Washington to our first grade kids that are getting an education, that this is something that can be solved. it can be solved correctly. And don't go in and say, what are we trying to accomplish? Kill an industry? No. Kill emissions? Yes. And then with that, then let the industry and the market figure out how to do that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and Steve, maybe you could continue on that thought, the idea of some of these directions and things driven by politics, certainly affecting our industry. Someone that's been in the industry all his life, in more a traditional sense, but making passages into new areas. Maybe you've got some comments you could make on that.
Well, I guess the first place I'll start is I remember President Bush, the second Bush, who grew up in Midland, by the way, really did, he talked about the term carbon intensity. And when we're trying to solve the carbon problem, we shouldn't be trying to solve where the energy comes from. We should be trying to solve their emissions. I think, Bill, you just said that again. And I think that's one thing that we've lost sight of is that, you know, there's lots of ways to reduce carbon emissions, and we ought to be tackling all of them as an industry. And the policy should reflect that. So I really do think that the governor and state of Wyoming, and I'll add North Dakota, is really in the lead on all of that. And I kind of tip my hat to Wyoming and North Dakota working together too, because I think the message, you've done a lot of that yourself, Lon. And I think the message gets stronger the more people say it. And so I'll leave it at that.
And your role today in all of this, Steve, what are you focusing on? What's your work focused in right now?
Well, I'm a consulting geological engineer, so, you know, I like to know what's going on below ground, which is never easy to figure out. As you pointed out, Bill, it's all about the rocks. And so we've tried to understand all the lessons we've learned in CO2 EOR. Is pretty tightly held technology and understanding. You know, learnings we've had have not been very widely broadcast. That's been the goal of our CO2 conference, and talk about case histories and the role of technology in those case histories, and try to advance that to other places. There's a lot of opportunity for EOR besides West Texas and Wyoming. The advantages we have in those two places is the infrastructure to move it around. And that allows us to do carbon capture and storage while we're doing oil. I love to use the example of the Chute Creek Reservoir, or Chute Creek plant and the LaBarge Reservoir, because here you have in Wyoming, you have the absolute largest source of industrial CO2 being captured in the world. And I think it's 300 million cubic feet a day now that's being sold into the marketplace at EOR marketplace, which is making about 150,000 barrels of oil a day in Wyoming alone, which is the lowest carbon oil being used around the world, I would argue. And so that is a big deal because they're storing CO2 that came from an emission source. And so I love that analog. And so I talk about it in a lot of places we need to do more of that. Let's see, your dry fork plant is going to be if it were going to the atmosphere, it would be less than what you're capturing at the Chute Creek plant. But you know, we need to do that. We need to utilize coal and capture that CO2 emission there, and that'll provide more CO2 for more EOR. And here goes Wyoming a double win. And those are the kind of things that I love to watch and see happen. And you're in a leadership role already in that. But as a consulting engineer, one of my problems is trying to get the surface people, which are the capturing companies, integrated with the subsurface people. And it's like two different worlds. Even the units interfere in trying to get that communication going. And so that's why I had that slide that I'd like to show if we have time. But that's been part of my role, not only the geeky stuff, you know, about what's going on in the reservoir, but also how to communicate the barriers and reduce the barriers between those two disparate entities.
Would you like to show that slide now? We can get that pulled up for you.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna need the clicker because it's not the first slide.
Well, he can move it.
Okay, he can move it for me. Yeah, I think this will do it too. And those are the subjects I think you're gonna cover today, but I just wanted to list them. One of which is this magnitude of the challenge. And then the need for geotechnical talent. And I know there's a lot of petroleum engineers and geologists saying, what's the future? You know, there's people around saying no more oil. Well, and that isn't gonna happen. My favorite story about that's my dad's story. I'll steal from him. He's gone now, but I'd come back from Washington in the early 2000s and say, oh, they're talking about the end of the age of oil. And he'd look at me and he said, have I ever told you the story about my walk up to the professor that was teaching petroleum at the world's leading institution at the time at the Colorado School of Mines? And he said, you know, I went up to him and said, I'm thinking about a career in the petroleum business. He said, what do you think? And the guy looked at him in the face and said, considering the fact that we found 3/4 of the oil in the world, he says, I think I'd change that idea. We hadn't even found the Middle East, and we certainly hadn't found the shales. So, but we're going to need that geotechnical capability for a long time. I promise you. The advantages of petroleum, oil and gas, and coal are irreplaceable. And so we're gonna need them. We just need the technology to reduce our emissions from them. Let me skip over here. That's my Chute Creek slide, which we'll skip over to this. This is my favorite slide on the magnitude of the challenge. This is from Shell. And by the way, that bottom line there is what we're storing with CO2 EOR today in the US. You can see it's not an insignificant amount of the challenge we've got out to 2050, which is that last bar graph. And so the 50 BCF a day is what they think we've got to capture, billion cubic feet a day. And I'll get to the conversion of that in a minute. But you can see on the left side, that's about a gigaton a year. Exxon's got a project in the Gulf Coast that they have to capture. They think they have to capture by 2050 from the petrochemical plants and along Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, that amount of CO2 to reduce their emissions. And you can see where that stands next to the US challenge. So it's significant amount of challenge we have in Texas and Louisiana to capture that CO2. And where do we put it? We got to put it underground. And we need that technology of the geotechnical people to help us with that. So there's risks of doing it. The beauty of Wyoming is you don't have much risk underground. I really think you don't have the soft sediments that the Gulf Coast has, which offers a lot of challenges for security of storage. You've got hard rocks, you've got great seals over the top. These are my list, and I think these will be provided for you if you're interested. But these are the kind of risks we've got to consider in secure storage. And we're going to tackle this in our CO2 conference in December in Midland with a whole day of talking about these risks and how to abate them. What you're not finding is people talking about these things. Nobody likes to talk about failures. And so we can have a lot of failures, and one big failure is going to be a real problem for our whole industry, CCS industry. So economic factors play into this, geotechnical roles play into this. So, but I'm taking too much time. You got to get more time for the other speakers.
Thank you, Steve. And that may be a good segue to you, Dr. Rasuli, and the Petroleum Engineering Department at Wyoming. What's your focus? What do you see as the movement forward for Petroleum Engineering Department?
In petroleum engineering program, currently we cover a wide range of upstream oil and gas disciplines, starting from exploration to development and production. But if you want to be a program which is well known and students choose to come to our program, not because they couldn't go anywhere else. I think we need to be industry focused. We need to be able to focus on areas which is of important and provide solution to the industry. Bill mentioned about 25% extra costs that they have in Wyoming, which I think is an opportunity for us. So we need to focus on those problems, those issues. And I ask Bill and other industry people, you need to tell us what the problem is. As much as I know the problem, we can solve it. So we need to focus on the areas of interest to Wyoming. So to me, EOR, if we can come up with solutions to enhance production from different type of completion design or smart completion, use the data analytics, which is very common these days, to find us what is available already from the data that we have, what the data tell us, instead of doing more work without the need of that. Or if we can focus on different areas, which is also related to energy. So any direction that the industry needs us in this state, I think that would be our focus. And this is where we are going, working with industry, working with the SER and other center of excellence in the state and around the world and in the country. I think that would be of importance to us. So basically, my point is that we need to focus and address the issues which is of importance to the industry. And the slide that Steve showed was great. This was exactly what I was looking for, to see what type of problem exists that we can focus and work on to hopefully help the industry to uncoat the complex reservoir that we have here.
Thank you, Dr. Rasuli. Are you finding challenges recruiting students? As student numbers a challenge for you? How do you address that?
This is a long-going problem, and I think the people here could probably help us a little bit today. So this is not a surprise that the cyclic nature of the oil and gas makes a student to come to this program when the oil price is high. So we tried with other departments at the petroleum engineering program in the country to convince the students and parents that if that is the criteria for your kids to come to the petroleum engineering program, let them come when the oil price is low, because by the time they graduate, hopefully it goes up. Don't do it in a wrong way. So we couldn't make that happening. So you can see the challenge we have. I think with the current, government and the way that they are targeting the oil and gas, unfortunately, we have a bigger job. And I think the job of myself as a department head is very important to give the message that, yes, there are other sources of energy, and we know that. But we are working on those as well, by the way. We are working on hydrogen production, extraction, and transportation. That's great, we do that. But I don't think in our next generation, we don't need any oil and gas. So still we need that. So we need to be, I think this is more of political than science that we are dealing with. But I think the education should come from early day. And this is what we started to do when I was in North Dakota, and the governor and other people were very, very supportive. I'm sure this is the case here. We need to start to advertise that from the early day of kids, from the elementary school. We need to go to the teachers, to the parents, and tell them this is not the industry that will die in our generation or next few generations. This is a direction that if your kids come to this discipline, to this program, they will have a big future. So they can work on many different areas for the state, and this would help to grow the energy, grow the economy of the state, and hopefully become #1 in terms of the science, in terms of the technology that we want. And I think this is a big job for everyone to advertise and tell the parents, and they'll tell the people in the state.
Thank you, Dr. Rasuli. Maybe we'll go back to Bill here for a minute. A lot of discussion and look at change of focus and directions for certain parts of the industry. Does your company look that way, or you remain focused on your core mission, oil and gas, emissions control? I mean, there's so many things now in the public arena. I'm just curious how your company, how you lead that.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the old Chinese curse. Maybe you live in interesting times. Yeah, we definitely are living in interesting times. But with interesting times and change also, that really gives you opportunity. That if you look at what's out there, it's a fast, dynamic, changing world. That means there's going to be lots of opportunities presented itself. How do we capture those? We're doing several things. In the adjacent space, if you will. One of the things we've looked at long and hard is what makes sense for E&P, what makes sense for energy. And clearly, we're all focused on the emissions and we're all focused on, the one from the petroleum. We know what the emission from that is, CO2. How do we address that? All forms of energy, literally all forms of energy have some byproducts. We've got to figure out how to do that. In our world, it's CO2. And so the thing we've talked quite a lot about is the most precious commodity in the world. The most precious commodity is capital. So what do we do with that capital globally? And what do we do with it as a company? So as we look at trying to address CO2, the industry's just done an outstanding job of progressing that. Is there still more to go? You bet. There's lots of opportunities for us to continue to take emissions out. But we've been, as a company, when North Dakota and the Bakken developed Harold Hamm, and the company actually worked with the government to say, we need to proscribe, higher and higher emissions levels that are allowed, or other way around, lower and lower emission levels that are allowed, sorry about that, but higher and higher capture rates that we were trying to end up. And so we worked with the government saying, here's a level. Harold and I were actually there earlier this year with the governor and said, and it's capped right now. They've got a number. This is what the industry has to deliver. And we said, that's not high enough. You need to raise it higher, and make it prescriptive to us. We're well above that. So, you could say, well, it's self-serving, but no, it's not, because the industry has to work together to take to up our whole game here, because it's a reputational issue with the industry. And we really need to focus on what we can do. So the thing we've looked at is we have a finite resource capital. What are we going to do with it? And so we're putting a lot of money into all the things that everybody's working on our missions, on our own operations. We could take it another dimension on our own operations. And so we're spending $250 million on the largest carbon capture and sequestration project in the world. It's a project to take about 10 million tons off of ethanol plants and take them to North Dakota for the reasons that the governor talked about earlier, that they have class 6 primacy to be able to put the CO2 away. So that type of project enabled us to capture, probably for the same monies, 10 to 20 times more tons of CO2 than we would have been able to do if we tried to say, let's go pick a little bit more. And so with that, we're going to be capturing and sequestering on our net share. Like I said, we've got about a fourth of the project, and the project's 10 million tons a year. So about 2.5 million tons is what, our share of the capital is going to contribute to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere that was going there. So we've done it for 2 reasons. Capital efficiency, got to address the emissions. We've also done it because there is an economic opportunity out there, but we still don't have the pricing right from the government. That's what we were talking about earlier. You got to get that number that matches what the reality is of how much CO2 that we want to take out of the atmosphere.
Thank you. And maybe Steve could continue in that direction. The governor mentioned the priority or importance of CO2 EOR in Wyoming. We have major projects here that we like to talk about. Monell Field that was producing about 170 barrels a day before CO2 injection went up to 7,000 a day. So we know there are high quality projects in Wyoming.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. And some that are understudy as we speak. And so that's pretty exciting stuff. And if you got the CO2, and I think Shoot Creek could expand. And I think there's other projects that are going to capture CO2 in the near term, perhaps even. Those are opportunities that are not only out there in the future, but they're not very far into the future as well. I wish we had more anthropogenic or industrial CO2 in West Texas, because we've got lots of projects awaiting CO2 ourselves, and maybe we'll get a pipeline down there. But the government is actually working on pipelines. There's some DOE money now that's hopefully going to come soon. The bureaucracy may get in the way of that coming quickly, but the government getting its own way on that. As I see it, the environmental justice, which is an important topic, is really slowed things down on in allocating those resources out to industry. So there's things that can be done in a very short time in that world. I will say that what I've seen in just the last 6 months is that the no more oil theme of the government has sort of switched back to saying all the above. I don't know that the real metrics and the diagnostics are out there to read quite yet, but I have seen that change, and maybe we can blame that on Putin. But nonetheless, there is a lot of movement back into saying, well, oil, gas, and coal are part of the solution now too.
And I think we're particularly motivated by the fact we can have carbon neutral oil, carbon negative oil through CO2 EOR. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, we probably ought to mention the 45Q incentive. In a typical American fashion, which I love, we said, let's put a carrot out there to try to advance technology instead of a stick. Canada chose the carbon tax. America chose an incentive, which was this 45Q, which was enhanced in that IRA bill that Bill mentioned, that Inflation Reduction Act that just passed a month ago or so. And that is a big number now. It's starting to look like we can capture a lot of CO2 off of plants that we couldn't capture before that number got codified. So we're in pretty good shape there to have a lot more capture occur, even when, and it's a tax credit, but it also put in there, and I think Manchin was responsible for this, but they put in there that if you can't use it yourself because your tax situation is such you can't use the tax credit, you can actually sell it and take revenues for that tax credit from somebody that needs it. Like Amazon or one of the IT companies that are making too much money these days, and trade it. And that's a real advantage. We hadn't seen anything like that since the coal bed methane tax credit way back when. So now your question, I've evaded your question. Oh, the carbon neutral oil. Well, what that tax credit has done, or what that incentive has done, is it's allowed us to make less efficient EOR projects economic. In other words, we can take part of that tax credit as the injecting company, or we can take a lower cost CO2, which makes those projects economic. And then once you're, it's kind of an irony, once you're less efficient, it's a carbon neutral oil because you're storing more CO2 making that oil than the combusted barrel emits. So it's really a whole new way to think about CO2 EOR with that tax credit for industrial captured carbon.
Thank you. And Dr. Rasuli, maybe you could talk a little more about research focus directions that you're seeing for your department, where you'd like to go research wise. If you've got some directions you're already initiating.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier on, our plan and objective is to make sure that we serve the state first and the country. And of course, we want to go around and help other countries if possible in terms of research. That's the longer term goal. But right now we are focusing our research on different areas, which is of interest to the Wyoming. Looking at the Maury Shale, for example, there are lots of things to do there in terms of exploration, in terms of geology, the complex nature that is here, talking about different completion design, how we can enhance the oil from underground, I think, and of course, the production. And again, the economy part comes along with that. In many cases, we can extract oil, but what is the price? So this brings also the economy into the play. So basically, we are focusing the areas which is related to EOR, related to carbon capture and sequestration, of course. So anything related to emission, of course, we work towards the energy area as well. Again, hydrogen is one of the big things, especially the storage part underground and at the surface is something of great importance to the industry. So these are the areas that we are currently working on. And again, any areas that is of interest to the industry and help the economy of the state, that's what we are going after.
Thank you. I think we'll take a little more dive into one question here, Bill, that came from the audience. The question is, how do you engage with people who are skeptical or even antagonistic about the oil and gas industry and the portfolio moving forward?
I haven't met any of those people.
Well, there must be.
There must be some out there. Huh?
At least one.
All right. Yeah, we could probably start in DC and find a few there anyway, but yeah, it's a great question. And we were talking a little bit about that earlier. It really is incumbent on all of us, and it's education. You know, and it's a broad brush of education, starting with our kids, making sure that, you know, they're educated and understand what is required, what is really needed, and what in the world I'm talking about, and what's the consequences of the decisions we're making. And then, you know, as I talked about earlier, you gotta educate the politicians, because they are putting in the rules and regulations that do impact our ability. You know, and it's a long haul. It's not a short haul that we're going to get people turned around, because we all know what's happened is that, you know, this emissions issue, you know, came to the forefront, and with some became a religion. And so you cannot argue science and facts against religion. Religion will win every time. So it's an emotional issue. And what we have done in the industry is a terrible job. If you look at, pick your time frame, it was kind of, you know, my world growing up as an engineer. Well, I understand petroleum, I understand energy, and I've looked at everything else. You're going to need this stuff. And so it's kind of simple math to me. I was missing the point. You know, this is an emotional issue that has to be addressed. And what we've done in the industry, facts and figures here, you ought to be able to understand that. We're talking here. We've got to talk here. And so that's why you'll hear me talk quite a lot about the 17 goals of the United Nations sustainability. You know, and again, number 7 is energy. And if you go through those first 6, you know, starting with poverty, you go to hunger, you go to education, you go to equality rights, you go to access to clean water. None of those happen without energy. And so if you start putting it in perspective of what energy does, and it's a little bit, the difficulty we have here is I describe it as a little bit of the pontification of the rich, you know, which is, if you look at the United States and Europe, extremely rich countries and areas of the world, we're kind of pontificating to the rest of the world. This is how you should be benefiting your livelihood. And this is what energy does for you. And by the way, we want you to use really expensive energy because it makes us feel better. You know, and that's just not the right way. So it's a collective education on our part. And the biggest education that is out there that starts in Washington, unfortunately, is if the United States went to 0, it doesn't move the needle. Yeah, I'm talking about emissions here, because if you look at China, and I lived in China, look at India, and I worked in India, you know, and you look at the economic growth opportunity in those countries, it's going to continue. It's based on, and anyone that's looked at GDP versus energy, it's almost a 1-to-1, or it's definitely a correlation, maybe a 0.7 to 1. But there is no rich economy in the world without access to reliable, dependable energy. And so all of these countries are going to go there. That's why they're still building the plants that they're building over there. And they're going to do that. And for us here to take on, you know, that back to that capital efficiency, if we want to go and really benefit the world, those capital dollars should be going into China and India. Yeah, I know that's a political morass to try to get into it. And I sure am not smart enough to figure out how to do that. But this is what the conversation has to be held around. Maybe we can take all the technology, all the things Dr. Rasuli's talking about, and say, there's a better way to do this that we can export. I'll give you I know this is you know, and I'm in the camp of all forms of energy are needed, but the US government, you know, is the messaging to the world that they want to get rid of one energy. And you saw that with President Biden. You've seen that with our energy secretary. They've tempered it a little bit with what's happening in Europe, but they have described, we want this energy in this industry to go away, petroleum industry to go away. And for those, and I just want to echo the comment that was made earlier, for those of you guys that have kids and grandkids and kids that aren't born yet, this industry in any scenario is going to be, I think it was described, 2 generations, 3 generations. You know, I came in the industry in the 70s. It's about 60 million barrels a day is what was being in demand. That was what was being used. In even the most aggressive analyses that are out there saying, hey, we need to go switch as fast as we can to all these other things. And nuclear is one of them we should be switching to. If we can go as fast as we can to all these other things, 40, 50 years from now, 60 million barrels a day. And when I came in the industry, it was boom time. And that's exactly what this industry is a declining industry. So every barrel we produce today, that's going to be a little bit less tomorrow. We're going to be able to produce, takes capital, takes people, takes petroleum engineers, takes government support. And so, yeah, advocacy is what it's all about. I know I've talked a little bit on this, but it's such an important topic. I'll end on one little thing that we're doing as a company. And so Harold Hamm founded our company. He just put $25 million personally into the Hamm Institute for American Energy. Continental put $25 million into it. It's in cooperation with Oklahoma State University. They've got a great building in Oklahoma City that we're putting the facilities in. And what we're doing is developing cooperation with universities. So we've got about a dozen universities that are signed up to work with us on energy. And we're also about that many companies and expanding that to address research and energy advocacy, because all of us need to be out there advocating for understanding what really is the truth around energy. And we're just not there yet. But remember, you got to touch here before you touch here.
Thank you. Steve, maybe you could pick up on that line about the financial assurance for CCUS and how that's affecting that industry moving forward.
Yeah, I guess where I can start there is that we've learned a lot of lessons from our horizontal water disposal problem. Oklahoma first learned it, I think, and then now West Texas is learning it. When we produce from a horizontal wellbore, we produce a lot of water with the oil. And we got to do something with the water. Right now, the bureaucracy doesn't let us use it for anything else but fracking and drilling, even though we can purify it to a point where it's fresher than the water we drink in Midland, which isn't saying much. But the whole business of the whole idea of technology is advancing so fast, and I think we're going to learn how to use that water in a very safe and beneficial use. We've got some senators and congressmen working on that in the state of Texas right now. And we're running out of Ogallala water in the panhandle. So, they even see another reason for doing it. But there's a whole lot of things that our industry can help with that we're kind of peripheral to, water being one of them, that we can lean on some of the petroleum engineers and the hydrologists and the geology profession to help us with. We've kind of got to break down those silos a little bit too. It's one of the things that seems to get in the way a lot, is that we train people in this specialized silo and they don't jump out of it. And I want to emphasize, and I think I've heard the doctor say it here, that we find that when we can solve problems easier when we are able to communicate across the silos. And it's been a bit of a barrier in the past, and I really do try to encourage the universities I talk to break down some of those silos and get a broader. And that's one of the exciting things about the SER, is that's what you're doing. And so I really laud you for that. It's a great advance. In I use an example. I'm going to take too much time perhaps, but we were studying these zones below the oil water contact and reservoirs, and we call them residual oil zones. And some of that's mobilizable with CO2, by the way, which we've proven in West Texas, and you're proving, I think, in a future project in Wyoming, the same thing. And then the beauty of that technology was we've also figured out where the H2S comes from in our sour oil reservoirs, because there's a microbial activity that goes on because of that water sweep and that created the residual oil zone. And so we had to jump out of our silo, in our petroleum engineering silo, to say, oh, why? What's going on there? And it's an example of that cross fertilization that can occur in the university as well as in industry. And I'm really a big fan of people doing that. When I see somebody that that does that, I immediately try to incentivize them even further with the thought that they need to encourage that in their own companies or in their own university setting. So.
Thank you. While you've got that microphone, we'll have one more for you here, Steve. Their comment in question is permanent sequestration of CO2. Is it a sustainable project? Given the fact that the government is the only sole financial source. What do you see as the future as that changes? These projects are limited in time. The 45Q has time frames put on it. What happens after that's gone?
Well, there's several drivers besides that incentive. The ESG movement, which many of you are familiar with, I think, environmental, social governance, and its pressure on the boardrooms. You probably know a little bit about that, Bill, that now they're thinking, okay, I got to reduce my emissions. I got to talk about carbon neutrality or my goals in carbon emission. That's another driver. So how much of this technology advance that we occur in the shorter term with this incentive, 45Q incentive, will be installed in such a fashion as to maybe make that not as big a deal in terms of the economic driver that we see right now. I mean, that's a big number, $60 a ton and $85 a ton for deep saline formation sequestration is a huge deal, and it's causing this action. Now, give it over to the industry to advance that technology and make it happen faster. The carbon capture thing is kind of getting in the way right now too, because it's so very costly to capture that carbon off these industrial sources, and there could be some really major advances there. Obviously, we're playing on the capture technology that the oil and gas industry developed back with amine separation many years ago, and that's sort of the baseline, but that doesn't mean it's the best answer either. And maybe the dry fork station will help with that, advance that technology, make this cheaper so it'll be more sustainable.
Thanks, Dr. Rasuli. You and I have talked, EORI and you, about how collaboration can help both move forward. Certain projects that we're looking at together, perhaps muddy formation being one. Are there other areas that you're looking to get into that you could use collaborative work with organizations, with companies, with agencies?
So based on the discussion we had with the EORI, with the SER, I think we defined a number of different areas of interest right now for the research, which is focused on practical application. Again, I focus on that. One thing I want to mention, when we are talking about the new generation of, different energy or hydrogen or renewable energy, I want to talk about the unconventional. So the technology that we see in the US now for the past 20 years, it didn't happen in over a decade. So it's very interesting to know the first well, which was drilled to study unconventional by name, was drilled about 100 years ago. So the research started from 100 years ago to get to the point that currently we can uncover and extract oil from unconventional shale with this current technology. So this tells us how long would it take for a technology to develop and grow. The same thing would happen with the renewable energy, I would say. So right now we talk about the hydrogen, for example, or other renewable energy. So there are lots of things to do, which is mostly at this stage of the research for now. And we shouldn't be, optimistic that it can happen tomorrow. So it takes a long term to get to the point that they are becoming economic. So we talk about the technology of those renewable energy. I don't think the focus is right now more mainly on the cost, is more of the technology. Let's first of all see how we can extract it, and then we talk about the economy side. So to back to the answer to the question that you asked. So while we're working on the current interests in terms of shale exploration, uncovering more from our shale, for example, again, in terms of the exploration, in terms of how we target, how we monitor, how we can do the better completion in terms of multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. While we focus on those areas, we want to also do research on the new type of energies as well. But this would be for probably the next generation who will continue to develop and use the outcome, which hopefully uncover the energy needs for the state and the country.
Thank you. And Steve, we've got another question I'll let you tackle here. CCS was big 20 years ago and died 10 years ago. There's been a big CCS resurgence these past few years. Do you see why it would be different this time, or what would?
That's a great question. Yeah, we were all hot and bothered about 2008, and then maybe it was not much before that, about getting all of this in place. And in Texas, the shales happened, so hey, you know, we were put on the back shelf, CCS, CCUS. And you know, I don't know that I defined that well enough for you, but CCS I call deep saline injection, where it's sort of waste disposal. But we're getting rid of it out of the atmosphere, so that's good. And then CCUS is where you're utilizing it and you're making a product with it. And now we've got oil value to a point where we can justify a CCUS very easily with very cheap CO2 perhaps with that incentive. And let's see, where was I going with that? Yes. CCS, yeah. And the resurgence now, admittedly, we've talked enough about being the 45Q incentive has really taken. I often use the analog of a fruit tree when I'm talking CCS, because the low hanging fruit are the sources of industrial CO2 emissions that are pure or they're pressurized. And that takes a big cost away from purification in one case and compression in the other case. And ethanol is a classic example of that Bill talked about, and gathering up those smaller sources into a network and piping them to a good source for storage. And so probably the next level up is a lower pressure or higher, lower concentration of CO2. And so now with the 45Q, we're up in the middle part of that tree with the fruit, and we can justify a lot of capture volumes. And that's what's created the excitement. I was talking to ARI here in the audience earlier today about their workload, their consulting engineer too, on that question you asked earlier. And they're busier than they can be, helping companies justify the product that they want to develop. Maybe it be a capture product or a storage project or a pipeline project to connect those two. And so there's a lot of that going on today. It is a resurgence. There's no question about it. I don't think it's going away for the reasons that we've been talking about and the reasons that Governor elucidated so well.
Thank you. Bill, we're got a question. If you could discuss or look at perhaps what you'd see the main operational challenges in the Powder River Basin.
Yeah, probably go back to my earlier comment on the just the cost side to get us there. The technology, you know, just continue to push the needle on that and push the envelope of what we can do to come up with better ways, faster ways to drill wells. You know, we're seeing pretty good results on some of the activities. You know, the nice thing about competition is you kind of look over your shoulder, you pay attention, you know, who's catching up with you, who's doing what. And that's probably the biggest thing that could happen here in Wyoming is get a few more of us in here showing, hey, there's a different way, there's a better way. You know, we learn from each other and we're all really competitive. So when somebody says they can do it better than I can, then I'm gonna look really hard and figure out how to do it better than they can. So I just think the challenge and that transfer of information, it's across the board though. If they're trying to get into specificity as to whether it's drilling, whether it's completion, yeah, I think probably the completion and learning curves still got a little longer tail on it than the drilling side of things. But across the board, yeah, we just need to drive that cost down. Technology is going to play a role in that, but probably the stimulation side is the biggest part.
And perhaps Dr. Razuli, that's an area where you could be very active, looking at these successes of different companies and what's working for one versus another.
This is exactly correct. And this is where we need the support from the industry and their advice and consultant to us to tell us, again, what is the problem? Tell us about the story. I know in general, getting the data and information from the industry in some cases are very difficult, and this is related to the confidentiality that exists. But wherever it's possible, I really would like to ask the industry and everyone in this room who can share with us some of their stories, some of their success stories, some of the failure. Failure are sometimes more important than the success, because we can learn from them to make sure that we avoid that. So I think getting those type of interaction with the industry and getting the lessons learned and also getting the experience is very, very important. We don't want to invent the wheel from the beginning. So we want to get the experience that the people have already gained in this state to make sure that we can move faster. So we work in the Balkan for a number of years. So I was mostly familiar with many of the formations, different type of completion, they did different type of production. But when I moved here and I look at some of the formations here, to be honest, it's very different. So this is how complex shales are, how complex the geology of the field is. So instead of just going and starting from the beginning, I think getting the experience of people and getting the knowledge from the industry, local industry, is very important. And this is how we can feed those experiences to the kids who come to our program and give them a good education. So when they go to the industry with the minimum on-job training, they can take the job and move forward, and hopefully we move faster into the next generation.
Bill, have you seen that type of cooperative discussion or platform available, for instance, in the Bakken, where multiple companies would discuss success, failure, things as they drilled wells in the Bakken? Have you seen this other places?
We do a lot of that in probably the most important space, and that's on the HSE side now. And that's one that pretty much all of us have gotten to the point. There is no competitive advantage on safety. There is no competitive advantage on environmental, like we talked about earlier. It's a rising tide. And so in that space, there's a lot of cooperation. In the space of, can we drive the cost down? Yeah, there's a cooperation, but it's still, it's still a technical world, and it's still a commercial world, and still a competitive world. So a lot of that gets shared after the fact, but that's, most states acknowledge that, and they've set up a system where if you come up with a great idea, it's delivering you, differential results. Okay, we'll keep it confidential for a while, but after a while, then it does become public. So most of this is free floating within a couple of years. The data is out there, and this just gets down to know-how.
And is there a particular role you could see for the University of Wyoming Petroleum Engineering, SER?
I think they're doing the things that they're talking about doing, that Dr. Rasuli's talking about doing, is working with the energy industry out here. He's got a great advisory board. Our Powder River manager here, Steve Smith, is going to be the representative on this. And so this is something that's going to be continuing opportunity for people to talk at that level, how to drive that program. And so that's what Dr. Rasuli, I think, is spot on. He's saying, hey, I want to drive my organization, meaning the University of Petroleum Engineering, in the direction that the industry wants to go. And so that's what we need to help him with, and say, hey, let's go look in this area.
Perfect. I think Dr. Rasulia might be a great opportunity for you to talk a little bit about that technical advisory board and what your hopes are, or what your needs are in that area.
This is exactly what we are planning to do. Our industry advisory board would be on 30th of this month, and we have a number of large companies, including Continental, Schlumberger, Halliburton, EOG, ConocoPhillips, and many other companies, local companies, are in our board now. This is so important. We are talking about educating kids to go to the oil and gas industry for the sake of this state, for the future generation of energy. We have difficulties, issues in terms of attracting students. So from my side, my job is to make sure the program is as flexible as possible. We offer a wide range of diverse courses and education for students to be able to move into the direction of the industry, because it's a very dynamic industry, oil and gas. So we need to give them the confidence that if they come to this program, they have a wide range of education, so they can move into any different disciplines that they need. And again, make as much possible the program flexible and more accessible to them. And this is what we are doing now. We are developing some master program, which is also available in distance. which is 1 year quick master for even non-petroleum engineers to come to this program, and they can get educated in oil and gas in a very short period of time and go and work for the industry. Right now, this is becoming available from next year. And we are doing research which is linked with a number of different industries. We have a number of opportunities right now that we're working on to develop practical research, which is of interest to the industry. And you will see all those new things coming up soon. And again, it is my privilege to work with the School of Energy Resources, with the EORI and everybody in the States. And I really seek the support from the people from the state and from the companies to help us to make this program a success, because this is important, because we are educating the next engineers for the state.
Thank you, Dr. Ruslian. I'd like to thank all our panelists today. I think we're just about out of time, but I would like to take a moment to thank myself, the Wold Family Foundation. Appreciate you putting this together, Peter, and your family, Jack. It's good to have you here. It's good everyone is here for Holly's support. Holly's my direct boss. So I have a privilege to work with Holly and SER, and I appreciate very much. It's a great privilege to have the job I have. So thank you very much for being here, and thanks for the Wold Family Foundation.